Hello and welcome everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. All right, hello and welcome everyone to the final day of Calm. Just a few reminders before we get started. I'm putting in the chat a link to our code of conduct. So if you haven't already familiarized yourself with it, please do. And note that on that page, there is a form to report any violations that you observe to the code of conduct. A few other reminders. When putting something into the chat, please make sure that you put panelists and attendees. Unless, of course, you want to reach out specifically to the panelists. And then a reminder about questions. If you could please use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen, that will just help us keep track of questions throughout. So, all right, it's my pleasure to introduce the session, What Kind of Leader Do You Want to Be? Picking a Leadership Style and Growing with It, with Laura McBrayer, who is the Senior Associate Director at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Take it away, Laura.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here with me on the Friday of a really great conference. I've enjoyed several of the sessions, and I think there's a lot of synergy between all the content. You'll hear some repeated themes in this, which I think is just good. It just reinforces everything we're learning. So a little bit about me. There we go. I won't tell you exactly how many years have elapsed between these two pictures, but the picture at the bottom was me taken by my dad when he drove me to pick up my very first paycheck when I was working at got my first job at our local public library. I don't know, I was like 14 or 15, and I was really not thrilled with my dad insisting on taking this picture, but when he found it and mailed it to me a couple years ago, I realized how wonderful it was that he had captured that moment for me. And the picture above is me just a few months ago, still in the library, but obviously a lot has changed, including I think I look a little more confident about the whole situation. So that's been my journey. As was in my introduction, I'm a Senior Associate Director, which means I have roles in library administration and then oversee currently 2 departments. We're doing a lot of change and growth at UNCW. So I'm hoping this is not a forever thing because it's a lot, but I oversee the Library Information Technology Department and Scholarly Research Services. Something that really has influenced my presentation to you all today is that I am in the EDD doctoral program in education and leadership, and really enjoying it, learning a lot, and a lot of what I've learned actually influenced this presentation. As my picture obviously shows, I've started out as a teenager shelving books, and I've gone through just about every position in the library, like many of you have. UNCW, if you want some context, is a R2 institution. We currently have 18,000 students. I think when I started at UNCW, we had, I don't know, 12,000, 10,000. It's been quite the journey. Randall Library currently has about 60 staff and faculty, and I have 8 direct reports. So that's a little bit about me, and I would like to hear a little bit about you all. So we are going to blow up the chat. One thing that's kind of neat about this presentation It's hard that I don't see all your faces, but it is great that we have the chat as a channel to share information. So if you would throw in the chat where you are on your leadership journey, you can use my terminology there or your own terminology. And if you have a leadership style, and if you do, what it is. So go ahead and throw that in there if you're comfortable doing so. Ah, someone's already picked out a style that we're going to talk about today. Yep. Oh, good. This is great. Okay. So we have a lot of newbies, a lot of you that have been doing this for a while and getting the hang of it. This is so much fun to see what you all have to say. I will say as we go through this session, I really invite any of you to chime in on the chat with anything that you feel would help to clarify, expand, even correct what I'm saying. Many of you may even have more focused experience with some of these models, and I really invite you to share your knowledge. That's what we're here to do. So don't hesitate to just chime in. I really appreciate that. I may not pay attention to everything you're saying because it's a lot, but I think the others that are watching the presentation would enjoy that. All right. So what we're going to talk about today, this is a quick outline of our session. I'm going to spend some time framing leadership a little bit. We're going to go through 4 leadership models that I've picked out for today. We're going to relate those to teams, crisis, change, and then talk about your style and your growth as a leader. So what is leadership? I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I thought leadership was about the characteristics that certain people had, things that were perhaps not even natural to me, like extroversion, confidence, charisma. And you know, while many leaders do have those qualities, that's not what defines leadership. So this here is the definition of leadership. And for full transparency, this definition does come from a textbook that was used in a class of mine. But I will say I went looking for other definitions, and this was still my favorite. So leadership is a process whereby individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So what are the implications of this definition? It's a process, so it's iterative, it's learned. It's about an individual who influences. So it can be anyone. It doesn't have to be a person who has the word leader in their title. It's whoever it is that's influencing. And it's outcome based. It focuses on goals. That's the whole goal of leadership, is to move a group forward in pursuit of a common goal. A few other things that I really think are important to mention as sort of frameworks and to acknowledge the complexity of leadership is to acknowledge that leadership is behavioral. So it's not about your traits necessarily, although that's a big part of it, but it's behavioral. It's about the things you do. It's about the actions, about the words that you use. It's something that can be learned, which is good for all of us, because that means that we can continue to grow our leadership through learning. It is a social construct, and this is important, especially as we take critical considerations towards leadership, and understand that, you know, leadership is different in different cultures, whether that's talking globally in different cultures, or whether that's in different professions, or even at different libraries. It really is something that we construct through social interactions. And this also affects gender and relationship to leadership, because gender is a social construct as well. And so those things intersect, a whole nother topic. Leadership is bi-directional. So it is not about what the leader does. It is about their relationships with their followers. And let me just point out, in leadership theory or writing or scholarship, the word followers is universally used to identify the people that are working with the leader. And I know that it kind of has a negative connotation, but that is the word, so I'm going to use it. Just wanted to explain that. You're only a leader if those that follow you see you as a leader. So it's a bi-directional thing. And I just think that's important to sort of hold in our heads as we talk about these models. All right. So the models we're going to talk about today, and I saw a bunch of these pop up in the chat earlier, are transformational, adaptive, authentic, and servant. So these are the models we're going to focus on. They're all sort of long established studied theories that serve as major frameworks Although there are different flavors of and variations on these models, there's a lot more models out there that can be used that have different benefits and uses, but I picked these 4 to talk about today because they're the ones that I feel most strongly support leadership through times of crisis and change, and we all know what we've been dealing with this last year. And so they were the ones that I felt would be of value for us to talk about. The other thread that runs through these models is that there's a real strong emphasis on building trust, which in my mind is the goal of leadership. So as we go through them, you'll notice that there's some of them are variations on a theme, and I appreciate all the previous sessions that have talked about these models as well. So why look at theory? You know, we have all sorts of information coming to us all the time about how we should be, what we should be learning. And it takes a little bit of time to step back and sort of look at theory. But I'm going to use a little cooking metaphor here. So if you want a good loaf of homemade bread, you'd probably do best to follow a recipe. You could probably figure out what the ingredients are, just like you could probably figure out what the essential leadership skills are. But without a recipe, without a model, you can't be sure what you're doing. And I'll take this analogy one step further. So I'm a fan of America's Test Kitchen. I don't know if any of you are America's Test Kitchen fans out there, but it's a cooking show, cookbook, whatever. I subscribe. I pay way too much money for their website, but I never trust a recipe that comes right off an internet because it hasn't been tested. So I only will make things from America's Test Kitchen recipes. And why? They test them again and again. And just like that, these models that we're talking about are to varying degrees evidence-based. There's scholarship around them. There's studies that have been done on them. So that's why I think it's important for us to look at these models. They also, one other benefit, and we're going to be looking at these, I love all the America's Test Kitchen comments. One other thing that these models have is they have some tested assessment tools, kind of like psychological assessments that are available. And so we're going to look at those and see how we can use those to move our skills forward. So speaking of assessment tools, and this is, I'm going to have Melanie, who is one of our panelists here, help me out, and she's going to pop some links in the chat to these things so that you can, if you so desire, open them up in a browser if you're at a computer that you have an extra window or so. The assessment tools for these leadership models are sort of copyrighted, proprietary, available in different ways. The first way is a website called Mind Garden. And this is actually a website that has all sorts of psychological assessments, assessment tools, personality tools that are available. And some of the assessment tools we're talking about today are available in their full form on that website, and they cost up like $15. So it's just something that you might want to do if you so desire to build your skills. The other place that you can find some of these assessment tools is actually in textbooks. And I just happened to find that even though it's like that this Northhouse textbook, which is one that we use, it actually has all their leadership questionnaires available as a zip file on that link there. And even though we are not in clinical leadership right now, this ebook here put out by Springer had 2 of the assessments for 2 of the models we're going to talk about. So that's why I'm sending you these links so that you can refer to them later and use them during this session. Okay, so our first model we're going to talk about, our first theory, is transformational leadership. So transformational is a terminology that is tossed around a lot. You know, you hear it a lot in the leadership literature that's out there on the internet. We're going to talk about a version of it, which is the theory that comes out of work done by Bernard Bass and other researchers. So the definition that I have there on the screen, that transformational leadership is about leaders that inspire others to accomplish change in exceptional ways. It's kind of my little paraphrase for how I understand it. So if you have worked for a leader who was able to accomplish things, who was able to accomplish significant change, but did it in a way that left people happy, that left people respecting them, that was changed based on their vision, then you may have been witnessing transformational leadership in that situation. So that's sort of the goal of transformational leadership, is to accomplish change through inspiration and motivation. There we go. One thing that transformational leadership teaches us is that there's a continuum of leadership, and that all leaders fall somewhere on this continuum. At the very bottom of the model is laissez-faire leadership, which is kind of like what it sounds: hands off, let it ride, don't really do much. Basically, this is non-leadership, and you obviously don't want to be at this level. Transactional is where rewards are contingent. You show up for work, you get a paycheck. And then reinforcement is negative. You do something bad, you get written up. But there's no inspiration or individualization that happens at that level. It's very more managerial, perhaps, although managers are great leaders too. But this is also a style of leadership. And again, the idea is that these two levels of leadership are not associated with good outcomes in the organization. And what you want to try to achieve is transformational leadership, which results in high achievement for the group by creating high motivation. So how do you create that high motivation? So in this context of transformational leadership, motivation is caused by these 4 factors right here. Oh, I have a chat. Can you see that chat over there? I shouldn't put it on that window, should I? Is that better? Okay, sorry. So these 4 factors. So idealized, and these are terms that come right from the theoretical model. They sound fancy, but they're once you start thinking about them, they're kind of intuitive. Idealized influence is when the leader behaves in ways that cause others to respect them, to trust them, to see them as a role model. It's leaders that have high standards for themselves. Some models out there sort of relate this area more to charisma, which is kind of more of a trait and less of behavior. But I think that you can see that earning trust, earning respect is all based on behavior. Then you have inspirational motivation. So this is when a leader is enthusiastic, optimistic, aspirational, has a vision, is hopeful. All of these things come together to create a model for the organization that looks at change as being a positive thing that they would like to work for. The next factor is intellectual stimulation. This is when the leader encourages creativity, encourages new ideas, different ways of thinking. And lastly is individualized consideration. So you have a leader who is acting with a high standard, who is inspirational, who is encouraging people to think differently, but also at the same time supporting and relating to the needs of individuals. Relating to individuals creates relationships with individuals. So what happens is you put all of these factors together at high levels, people become motivated, they become inspired to achieve goals that are set by the leader. So if this model interests you, if you would like to pick this for yourself, you can ask yourself questions on a regular basis, like, am I behaving in ways that allow others to respect me? Am I setting high standards? Am I demonstrating vision? Am I optimistic? Am I encouraging creative thought? Am I supporting people individually? This is how you work towards this model. One issue to be aware of with this model is that you have to be careful of burnout in your people. So if the goal is to get people motivated and engaged and achieving things, after a while, this pushing towards these goals can cause burnout. So a way to manage that is to back off at times and let everybody enjoy the success before you sort of push on with whatever the next thing is that is in your vision. So how do you sort of apply this to yourself? This goes to those assessments that we were talking about. So I think I have a link that it would be great if Melanie would put in the chat. So a few different ways to get to the assessment are, you can do the full version, which is like a 50 question questionnaire on Mind Garden, if you want to go back and do that sometime. Then we're going to get a link in the chat to a PDF that has a sort of shorter version that's available on the web for free. And then what I have here on the screen is a screenshot coming from copyrighted material coming from this textbook here where you can answer questions and you can see how they relate to the different factors of transformational leadership, and you can rate yourself. So what would be ideal is if you all would, if you have the ability to pull up the PDF and maybe take out a piece of paper and pen and rate yourself, at least start the process. It's something you want to think about. If you don't have that, take a look at what you see on your screen here. And we won't have time to do the whole thing, but let's take a minute and sort of have some awkward Zoom silence and take a look at these questions. And if you have any reactions while you're doing this to this assessment, go ahead and throw it in the chat. Yeah, person put in the chat that you can't be a transformational leader in an organization that doesn't want transformation. And I agree, it's hard. Not all organizations are at that point, but I think the idea is that the leader finds ways to make the organization want to do it. That's the tricky part. Yeah, good question. Good point about the questionnaires make you skeptical because you rate yourself positively. We're going to talk about that later. And we're going to talk about the importance of 360 assessments. And in fact, some of these assessments we're looking at will tell you, you go take this to 5 people and have them fill it out about you. So absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Great. Yep. All right. So I know that doesn't really give you enough time to go all the way through this, but you can see it as a tool that you can return to if you wish. All right, next we're going to talk about adaptive leadership. And in this model, so unlike transformational leadership that sees change as something that's accomplished by the group based on motivation and inspiration that the leader generates, adaptive leadership says that there's environmental change that we need to adapt to, hence the poor polar bears that are in a non-snowy environment who are having to adapt to climate change. So adaptive leadership says that there's changes in the environment that we need to adapt to, and it's not an easy process that all people want to face. So the work of the leader is to encourage and support people to adapt or change in response to these complex problems. And I do see some people are putting some questions. If you want, like if it's a broad question and you want us to look at it later, do remember to put it in the Q&A later, for later. So adaptive leadership has 6 different processes or elements, behaviors that leaders can do. It's broken out into 2 slides here. So what the model says is that if you are faced with a situation where you need to guide an organization through change, this is what you do. So first step is get on the balcony. This is about stepping outside of the problem, getting perspective, not jumping into solutions, seeing the big picture. And they recommend even doing this in the middle of a meeting. People present a problem to you. Obviously, stop, don't jump into problem solving, and even step back a little further and not put on your leadership hat right away, but just observe the problem and hear the issues. Then the next thing a leader should do in this situation is identify the adaptive challenge. So this theory talks a lot about that there's a difference between a technical problem. So technical problems are those that can be solved by a change in process or a change in structure or getting an answer to a question. That's different than an adaptive problem. So adaptive problems are those that can't be solved by a small group of people or one person alone. They're changes that challenge the status quo. They're changes that require changes in people, in their beliefs, in their habits. And they're also often a cause of stress. So this model says it's important to separate those 2 kinds of changes so that leaders can respond differently. With technical problems, you can respond more with knowledge or authority, whereas adaptive problems require the different pieces that we're going to talk about here. The next thing an adaptive leader needs to do is regulate distress. This is both within the organization, within individuals, as well as within themselves. So to do this, the idea is that change causes stress, which is good in some ways because it leads to change, but it can be too much sometimes. So the goal of a leader is to manage the levels, the sort of fire hose of change that might be coming, sort of hold back on it if you need to, manage levels of organizational and individual stress. You can do this by creating what they call a holding environment. So a holding environment is a space, whether physical, virtual, a group space like a task force, a process like a way that you have a discussion, but you create a holding environment where the problem can be talked about in a safe way. And you try to keep it so that it doesn't then overrun everything else that you're trying to do and become overwhelming. So you create this holding environment within a sort of agreed upon safe space that you can deal with the problem. The other thing leaders need to do is to provide clear structure, direction, orientation, accepted norms. All of these help regulate the right amount of tension for the group, so that you can feel positive about that there is process, but you sort of know how that process might work. And lastly is regulating personal distress. So this is regulating your own distress. So monitoring, taking care of your well-being, as well as seeing when individuals are at points of stress and supporting them through that, or regulating it as taking work off of them, taking a burden off of them, giving them the support that they need. So that's an important piece of an adaptive leader. 3 more processes. An adaptive leader needs to also maintain or focus attention on the problem. So often when we're faced with change, we want to ignore it, not face the problem. And a leader needs to sort of turn the attention of the organization, of the group, back to the problem in just the right way. And then to get through it, they recommend giving the work back. So you empower and encourage people to solve problems. You look for answers in different places. And then lastly, and this is kind of really interesting, they say in adaptive leadership, it's even more important to what they call protect voices from below. This is to make sure that you that you listen to the voices of your low status, marginalized, perhaps non-conforming voices. And the point of this is that during times of stressful change, those are the voices that may be less on board for reasons that they will express, and that it's important to hear this dissent so that people aren't left behind. Change is not good. Change is not good unless sort of everybody comes along in the end. So if this is the model that appeals to you and you would like to utilize, you first work on confronting problems, identifying them as technical or adaptive, and then think through how to apply each of these behaviors to the problem. You can ask yourself questions like, am I keeping the group focused on the big issues? Am I listening to voices from all levels? Am I encouraging people to solve problems? Am I creating a safe space through which we can work out a problem? And am I regulating my own distress? So that's a quick overview of adaptive leadership, and we will look at an assessment tool here. And again, we'll throw a larger version of this into the chat where you can get a PDF version of this that will tell you how to rank it. What is it? Analyze it, where you can match up your scores in the right way. You'll notice that this is a version of an assessment that says definitely go take this to others that know you, whether they're coworkers, people that are in your group, supervisors. What you see on the screen here is just like the first 10 questions. I forget how many questions there are, maybe 20, but it goes down some. And so again, just take a minute, 30, thank you. Take a minute and skim through this. I know that we definitely won't be able to assess ourselves during our awkward Zoom silence. And again, if you have any insights or thoughts, go ahead and throw them in the chat. All right. Well, I hope that you come back to that later when you have some more time. Next up, authentic leadership. I know that a bunch of you put this in the initial call out about your styles. So the focus of this model is how to create a relationship between the leader and the follower that is built on trust, which is accomplished through being authentic or being real, hence the rubber duck and the real duck. Animal pictures are always a good metaphor. So in this model, leaders are followed because they're trusted. We're going to approach this from two different perspectives. One is 4 competencies that authentic leaders should focus on. And then we're going to have the next slide is going to be about 5 behaviors that you might focus on as an authentic leader. So an authentic leader focuses on self-awareness. Self-awareness is about having an acute sense of your strengths and your weaknesses. It's about being aware of your personal perspective, about your biases. And to do this, use all the tools you can find. You know, a lot of us have done like the emotional intelligence, strengths finder, mindfulness, any of those tools that help you to build your self-awareness is important to be an authentic leader. Relational transparency is also another competency. This is about being honest in your interactions with others. It's about being open, about being sharing, but appropriate. And some models or variations on this talk a lot about bringing your true self to your workplace, which means the idea is that there shouldn't be a disconnect between who you are in your real life and then who you are at work. This kind of is alarming to some people, and I can understand that. But if you think about it, it reduces sort of that dissonance or sort of disparity of control that you have to have about who you are. And if you can use the tools that you use in your home life and use them also in your work life, it just enables all of that more strongly. I'll tell a little story. I think I have time to tell a story. I was texting with one of my sisters, and she was describing a situation at work that she had, and I pulled out a crucial conversation script to give her some advice. And we were texting about that, and then later she's like, "Oh, I gotta go now. I gotta go be a wife and mother, and there's issues that then I have issues there. What do I say there?" And I'm like, "It's the same script." And I think that is a powerful point, is that the same script can be used perhaps in the different situations if you are being honest in your interactions and using your true self. All right, balanced processing is about gathering all the information to allow challenges to your beliefs, having an open mind, being objective, avoiding bias, listening before deciding. So that's what an authentic leader does. And then lastly, the moral component is important in this model. So authentic leaders have internalized moral processing. It starts with an established set of values that you hold, and then expands to include the alignment of your behavior with those values. And the goal of all of these competencies is to build trust. So if people feel like you're being open, honest, transparent, your behavior aligns with your action, or sorry, your words align with your actions. You're listening to all sides. People will trust you, and that is, I think, the goal of leadership. One of the goals of leadership. All right, so let's look at this from a slightly different model. Same model, different perspective here. This is any of you familiar with Bill George? This is his conception of authentic leadership. So the purpose, these are the things that you should be focusing on to be an authentic leader: establishing strong values, moral reasoning, using them as your guiding force, defining your purpose and your mission and being passionate about it, knowing like why you do what you do and enjoying it. Part of that is having that hope and optimism and enthusiasm. Leading with the heart is what it sounds like. You demonstrate compassion towards others. You're open. You show caring. Self-discipline is about establishing your standards and objectives and then being accountable to yourself towards reaching those goals. It also demonstrates your consistency between your behavior, between your words and actions. And this also goes a long way to building trust. And lastly, being authentic is about establishing relationships. It's showing appropriate care for individuals. And I do use the word appropriate because, you know, there are lines that we have to draw about our relationships with people. But it is about creating connections with people, listening, sharing. I'll show you my story, my picture from when I was 14, and tell you my story about my sister texting and my love of America's Test Kitchen. So that is establishing relationships. So that's authentic leadership. I think a lot of you have a lot of experience with this, and I appreciate that. So assessment. Again, there's a full version on Mind Garden. It actually is even linked in with the multi-factor leadership questionnaire from Transformational Leadership. There's a version I found online that's in the chat. This is what you see on your screen is a version out of the textbook that's also available to you online. And let's sort of do the same thing. Let's take a look at some of the assessment factors. I really enjoy all your comments in the chat. All right. I'm sorry, that's all the time we have for this. Again, if you have any other thoughts about that, critical leadership, yep. That's a good question for at the end if you want to throw that in the Q&A. All right, servant leadership. So in this model, the goal is it flips to be on the followers. It's about serving others to accomplish the goals of the organization. So there's a real strong ethical component to this model. I saw some of you had put this in the chat as well. So there's 7 behaviors that we're going to talk about that are part of servant leadership. The first is that you as a leader need to maintain conceptual understanding of your environment, meaning that you need to have a deep understanding of the organization and the work that happens in it. Because without this knowledge, it's very difficult to contribute in a servant-based way to the organization. This is an interesting component. Supporting emotional healing is about recognizing the personal concerns of others, being available to others to give them the support when they need it, being sensitive to well-being. Putting the followers first. So this is the behavior that's kind of unique to this model. This means that the interests of others become the priority. You are there to make sure that they succeed. That's your priority. And in fact, sometimes you put their interests and success ahead of your own. In this model, you always mostly put them ahead of you. Along with this is helping followers grow and succeed. And to do this, you provide support and resources, but more than that, you need to be aware of how people want to grow. So what are their goals? How can you help them grow? And then this, you take time to be a mentor, you encourage and you ask them about their goals. And the last 3 behaviors of servant leadership are to behave ethically. So in this, you have principles, you stand by them, you aim to be open, fair, honest. You empower others. This is about sharing power. So allowing other people to make decisions, allowing them to handle the situation, allow them to solve problems. And in that you help support and empower them. And then one other unique thing about this model is it's important for servant leadership to demonstrate that they are interested in creating value for the whole community, that they contribute to the greater good. They perhaps demonstrate servant leadership beyond just the workplace, and that enables people to respect and see them in a different light. One issue to be aware of with this model is around burnout. This is more for the leader. So in this model, burnout is an issue, and self-care is even more important. So just because others are the priority doesn't mean that you should neglect yourself in this leader, and that's in this leadership model, and that's a fine line to balance. All right, here is the assessment for servant leadership, and put the link in the chat. And this is another long one. Again, I forget how many questions are in this. I don't know if anybody can see that. And it's also interesting that this assessment also does say that you should definitely consider distributing, 23, consider just distributing this to other people. So thank you. All right, I am going to move on. So those were the 4 leadership models. We're going to sort of pull this all together and talk about teams and change and your growth in the last, we got like 8 minutes, I think. So talking about teams, so going back to the definition of leadership, that was about influencing others to accomplish common goals. So how do you get others, your team, to follow you to achieve a goal? And I'm going to distill this down to one factor, although if any of you have some other things that you want to throw in the chat about like the sort of number one thing that you can do for a team to accomplish goals, feel free to do that. But for me, and I've said this already, it comes down to trust. I love this definition of trust right here. It's kind of scholarly, simple at the same time, helpful. It's an expectation or belief that you can rely on another person's actions and words, and that person has good intentions towards yourself. You know, in the study of effective teams, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Project Aristotle that Google did. There's lots of other studies of teams. The top indicator of whether a team will be effective is actually whether there's trust in the group. This is also referred to as psychological safety. So if you think back on the models we just looked at, a lot of them talked about how you establish trust, how you align your actions with your words, how you show that others can rely on you, how you show that you have good intentions towards the team. And the goal is that if you are a trustworthy leader, if you focus on those qualities in the models that are building trust, you can create a culture of trust that then will help you create effective teams. So one thing I want us to think about, if we have time, is how those leadership models focus on creating various levels of trust in the culture. We will, let's talk a little bit about change and crisis. I know there's another good session that sounds like I think it's going on at this very same time. So thinking about leadership and during times of change and crisis, which is what we have been dealing with, I sort of went through and pulled out sort of the important pieces of change and crisis and for leading through change and crisis that I thought were of importance to talk about. And you'll see that there's similarities, but there are differences. So change and crisis are perhaps similar things, but on a different continuum of emergency. So both change and crisis require supporting others. They require modulation, whether that's modulation of distress or modulation of how much change is going to be happening. But in change, you can focus on process, but in crisis, you need to make decisions. There's not always time for a process, although hopefully you have processes in place that will help go through crisis. With change, you're working towards a vision. With crisis, you're getting through something with hope. And change, you should be focusing on getting input, but crisis, because you have to respond quickly, often requires creativity. So very similar concepts, but just different enough to make us think differently about how we might apply leadership models. So clearly, the adaptive change model is good for change, but it may not work for crisis because it may be a little bit too slow. You may not have time to get on the balcony and to regulate all the distress and to listen to all the voices. Transformational leadership, perhaps, could work for both. It is about change, but it also has enough flexibility in it to deal with crisis. I think that authentic leadership is one that works in both situations. And servant leadership, I think, is great for change processes. It may be difficult for a servant leader to sort of overcome the emergency aspect of a crisis, to be able to make those decisions in a quick way. So that's sort of how I see these models being applied to change and crisis, but I would love to hear if anybody else has any thoughts of how you might differently apply it, or other models that you're aware of that you think would be ideal for leading through change and crisis. And this is a whole nother topic, obviously. All right. 2 more slides, and then we're done. So picking a style. This is the whole point of this presentation, is that I hope that you can see that there are different models out there that are available to you. And I encourage you to spend some time researching these models or other models or styles that are out there. And in order to pick a style, I encourage you to figure out which ones resonate with you. So when you did those assessments and you looked at the questions, which ones were you like, yeah, I do this, this makes sense. Those are your natural style, and you should run with it if you can. You might as well just use something that works for you. But what you're going to do is fine tune that style as you go forward. You also might want to take it from the perspective of, what does your organization need? All of us have very different organizations. Some of us are needing more change management than others. Some of us are in a position of great growth and optimism. Some of us need to build the trust. So think about what your organization needs and consider adapting a model that works for your organization as well, because then that will be a benefit to everybody. What tools or communities are available to you? So different institutions have different tools or different training opportunities. So like on our campus, we're into StrengthsFinder, we're into crucial conversations. And so if I build my leadership model or look for models, I would be better supported if I chose ones I had those tools or communities available to you. And then lastly, look to those leaders that you admire. Try to match up a style to what you admire about that leader, and perhaps consider adopting that style so that you can see it in action as well as learn about it in theory and put that together in your own practice. Lastly, how to grow with a style. Self-assessment. So we all know the value of assessment. We know how hard it is. It's even more so true with self-assessment, but it's really an important piece of growth. So what you should do is pick a style, find that assessment tools. I gave you some of them today, and be honest with yourself. I think someone in the chat when we first opened up the assessment tools said, yeah, we're not always so honest with ourselves. We tend to overrate. And I think that's very true, but be honest with yourself. And the areas that are not your strengths are just areas to work on. It's not problematic if you're not ideal in all the places. Next is the other important thing, and again, many people put this in the chat earlier, and that is seek out 360 assessment. Ask your peers, ask the people that work for you, ask your supervisors or people and levels above you to do the assessment for you as well. One thing about using some of these survey-based tools is that it's a little bit more palatable than sort of constructive criticism or text-based evaluation. It's a little bit more, you can do it anonymously, give people a paper, and well, who does paper anymore, right? But you can have them do it in a form where you don't know who it is that filled it out. It's really important to get that feedback from all those areas. Then take the results of those assessments, put it on your calendar. So we all live by our calendars. This is something that I did a while back, and I should probably do it again, is I made a list of different qualities of leadership that were in the model that I was looking at the time that I wanted to work on. And I put a reminder on my calendar for every Monday morning for one of those items. So let's say one week it's about being open, and another week it's about empowering others. What you do is you go through your week, try to infuse this at your thought process. So before you go into your one-on-one meeting with a person, if that week the theme is being open, say, how am I going to be open with this person? If you go into group meetings, think about how you're going to be open in that group meeting. And so what it does is it turns it into more of a habit, lets you chunk the skills a little bit, gives you some behaviors to focus on. So put it on your calendar, make it your theme for the week. I want to encourage, it seems weird to say to a bunch of librarians, but read, and read books and articles, because a lot of the easy to digest stuff is pop culture stuff, it doesn't really get you deep enough into the models to really work with. So I have some resources, some books at the end, or classics. There's a lot of stuff out there, but read books, um, study other leaders. Uh, Again, learning from example is one of the best ways to grow. So pick a leader who you admire, although I know some of you may say that's sometimes hard to do. You can study bad ones too. You can learn an awful lot about a bad leadership from a bad leader as well. So what do you observe them doing that you see is something coming out of these models? What were the outcomes of those behaviors in your organization? And lastly, leadership is an iterative process. It's not a state of being. It's a thing that you have to constantly work at. So repeat all of these things as you grow with your style. That's my presentation. I have some credits for images, and I have some resources here of books. Like I said, many of these are a little older, and they're sort of like the foundational literature in some of these theories, and I'm sure there's lots. You know how to find a book. So that's it. Questions?
All right, thank you, Laura. So just a reminder to throw questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom page. You can also upvote questions if you want to push a question to the top. So Laura, the first question that we have here, is it possible to fit into multiple leadership styles or change styles depending on the environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think absolutely. You can think of it as a mastery. So you master one, you might as well master another. But I do think the environment is really important. If someone mentioned that some organizations are not ready for transformational leadership, and that may very well be true. And so launching into that mode may not work in that environment. There's really, when you read about leadership, it's all variations on a theme. So the multiple styles, yeah, it's absolutely true. The purpose of picking a model is just so that you have something to focus on, something to guide you. It doesn't mean you have to stick with it.
Great. The next question is, I identify aspire to all of these. Is it a weakness to have a clearly defined personal leadership style? Perhaps a combination would work in terms of finding personal direction.
Yeah, very similar question. I agree. I see things in them all that I aspire to. I definitely agree with that. And I think, again, if you are at the point where you feel like you have mastered something and you're ready to create your own style and pull out the elements that work for you, that's great. If you are more in the beginning of your journey, you might want to just stick with a model so that you can master it.
Great. I love this next question. Have you seen examples of how middle managers adapt their leadership style in response to how their administrators are leading? For example, library deans and their direct reports.
Yeah. Oh, I love all these questions. Yes. So it depends on if your leader, the higher leader, is a good leader or a bad leader, I think. Or that may be too harsh, but I think it also depends on how they are at leadership. And so if you're in a situation where you're having to overcome some difficulties in the higher leadership, you might focus, you don't need to be transformational. You maybe need to be more servant or more supportive. If the transformational piece is missing, perhaps you can step up and engage in that transformational perspective. So I do think that again, the organization and the environment should affect your leadership, and both sort of through balance as well as through synergy. It also is really great, and I've seen this happen. I think I'm in a situation where I'm very happy about our leadership at our library, that we actually can build our synergy and build our leadership by having similar models as well. So I think it just depends on the situation.
Next question. Do you have any observations about how these different styles are valued or devalued by organizations? Some seem more associated with achievement culture, gendered behaviors, etc., than others.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about gender and leadership. I have a lot to say about that. Um, I think that these models are really, the goal of these models were to be um, really thoroughly studied and able to translate to different organizations. You know, when the researchers put these out there, they're really trying to figure out sort of global or universal models. But I do think that, again, different models work better in different cultures. And like I said at the beginning, leadership is a social construct, and um, all of our culture and what's happening within our cultures do impact how leadership is perceived and how leadership is valued. I'm sorry, I can't give a more specific answer than that, and within our time frame.
Thank you. And I think our next two questions are pretty closely related. But the first one is, what is the best time or way to introduce a 360 to your staff? And do you go over the results with your team, indicating what you intend to work on, especially if you intend to be one leadership style and they seem to or want a different leadership style?
Yeah, it's really important that if you're going to do a 360, that you then demonstrate when it's complete that you are listening to what you're learning. And this goes back, I think the authentic leadership really speaks to this, to be transparent and open about how you want to grow as a leader and why you value hearing their feedback. It's not, it's it's for your own personal growth. So showing that you want to grow as a person, just like you encourage them to grow as a person. It's modeling good behavior. So it's modeling that you can take feedback and that you can learn and grow. And I think if you put it in those contexts and then you demonstrate and model that behavior, I think it can be well received. I think 360s go bad when people give feedback and the leader doesn't do anything with it. So I do think you need to be open and transparent. You don't have to be you don't have to be transparent about the details of what you learned, but you have to be transparent about what it means to you and why you're doing it. I will say that at my institution, we do 360 reviews in my library. And it's been, I think, very helpful. It's also helpful for your supervisor to evaluate you if you want to go that direction. It doesn't have to be part of the evaluation process. It can be just something that you do when you demonstrate your own personal growth. I think, again, I think it's modeling good behavior.
Great. We might only have time for one more, but it sort of builds off of this conversation,
Okay.
which is, are there risk or dangers of the burden on your direct reports in sending these as like 360 evaluations? And do you have any suggestions about when is a good time to send these and when is a bad time to send these?
Yeah. Well, like I said, we do it around the evaluation cycle so that it seems sort of like a natural process of evaluation. Just like you're asking your people to go through an evaluation process, you're willing to go through that yourself. Is it extra work? It depends on, again, I think if it's seen as adding value to your department and to your team in terms of the value that you will try to give back as a leader by what you learn in it, I would hope that people wouldn't see it as extra work. You could, I don't know, those are my suggestions.
All right, I think we have time to sneak in one more question. What's the difference between a leadership style or model and adapting specific leadership practices? For example, I have adopted many reflective leadership practices, but I don't know if that's a model or style that has other elements.
Yeah, so that goes back to when I was talking about like the whole recipe thing, that models are sort of fully developed and they perhaps have some research around them, some empirical data around them, some application of the models in different contexts. And so they're like putting together all the different pieces that go into creating a leader and having outcomes associated with that leadership. Whereas practices are things that we can engage with, that we can add to our repertoire of things that we do. they're easy to digest, they're easy to understand. And I think a lot of the practices that were listed in those models, we see sprinkled in all sorts of different places. So again, you don't have to go into the scholarly side of leadership. I just was intrigued by it when I was learning about it. Like you, like many of you, I'm what I would call an accidental leader, where I didn't really intend to start to be a leader. And I have achieved or been great, put in a great position for a variety of reasons across my many decades. And so here I am, and I would like to do a good job at it. And so that's why I find value in understanding the scholarly theory model behind leadership.
Okay, I'm going to make an executive, thank you. I'm going to make an executive decision and say we probably don't have time to do the last question justice, but would you be open to the person reaching out to you directly for your thoughts?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And I saw a lot of questions about women and gender, and I agree, and I'm sorry we don't have time to talk about that stuff too, and critical leadership as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a really engaging and an interesting session, Laura. Lots of gratitude going out in the chat as well. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.